Hello. Well, everybody, hello. I'm Jude Kelly, Artistic Director of the Southbank Centre. Just about got a voice left. Thank you. It has been absolutely an amazing festival this weekend because of everybody here who has made it an amazing festival. We haven't finished yet. I'm just going to do some talking about something I've been thinking about recently. And then we're going to have a live Skype with Christine Lagarde and the One campaign to talk about the future. But I'm grateful for the WOW Festival, for making me think about things which I hadn't really fully studied properly before. And sometimes I suppose that's because in order to lead what we would call, in inverted commas, a normal life, one has to get on with things and not always address everything every single day. If every single day we addressed the level of inequality which is actually around us, we would be utterly exhausted and very unpopular. However, I probably am trying to encourage myself to be certainly more unpopular and maybe more exhausted, and I'll tell you why. I've had the privilege this weekend of listening to testimony by women like myself who, in their case, have survived domestic abuse or physical violence or sexual assault or rape. I say in their case because I don't believe there is a woman in the room or a girl in the room who can't accept that there but for the grace of luck, we'll say, go I or I have gone. And so when you listen to the testimony of those women who have stood forward and said, I'm going to get rid of the idea that this is a personal secret and a personal shame, and put it out in front of people and say, this is about the way a massive power balance in the world acts out on individual lives. And I cannot take responsibility for this power imbalance, but I have suffered the result of it. When they put it forward to us, not as an example of their shame, but as a piece of knowledge which we have to understand, then I feel humble. Because that act of bravery on their part equals any other act of bravery, and we've witnessed many this weekend, of women who say, look what this power imbalance is doing. How can we stop it? How can we change it? Now, you don't go to festivals about human rights without hearing an awful lot of statistics. And of course, one can get statistic blind, one can get statistic glib. But what I've been trying to do, because of the privilege of listening to these women talking to me about their experiences, I've been trying to accept the fact that whatever the circumstances of my life might have been, I am with them. I am part of the same world in which they have experienced what they have experienced. I'm not a separate person living in a different time on a different planet with a different tribe, looking at a group of people who are suffering. I'm part of that same group. But I can see why I would try to avoid knowing that in some way. Because not one girl or woman wants to be labelled a victim, because everything we're told about victim and the word helpless always goes next to it. And not one girl or woman wants to be defined by inequality because of this burgeoning sense that you carry all the way through your life until you die, that your potential is yet to be realized. So I've gone back to look at some statistics that I'm going to read to you. And every time I read the word woman, I'm just trying to make sure I do sit within that word and don't project into some other group of people in some other place, in some other nation that's not me. And I'll just start with this one. Women account for nearly 2/3 of the world's 780 million people who cannot read. So 2/3 of the women of the world can't read. Women account for 70% of the population living in absolute poverty. That's on less than $1 a day. So that's where we're up to, our tribe, women. 2/3 of us can't read, and 70% of us are earning less than $1 a day. We make up 80% of all refugees and all displaced people. That's what we make up. That's us. Us in this room, we're part of 1 in 3 women who have been beaten, coerced into sex, or abused. Us women, that's our tribe, we work 2/3 of the world's working hours. We produce half of the world's food. We earn 10% of the world's income, and we own less than 1% of the world's property. There are 3/5 women CEOs in the top 100 FTSE companies, and globally, women make up 17% of parliamentarians. I find it really difficult to read those out on one level because it makes me immediately flip towards a sense of shame. I don't know if you understand, all of you, what I mean by that, but I want to believe that I don't belong to a tribe 2/3 of whom can't read. I don't want to know that I only earn 1%. I don't want to know that I own no property. I don't want to know that I'm likely to be beaten, raped, and coerced. I want to feel, Jude Kelly, the world's my oyster. But it isn't. And if it is a bit of an oyster, and I have a bit of a chance of a pearl for me, then that is probably because so many other people before me, men and women, spotted just how desperately unequal the world was and started having a go at changing it. And thus, in our lifetime, we've seen votes for women, we've seen education for women, we've seen laws come into play, etc. But we are still absolutely dogged by the fact that because the power structures say that one group of people hold power and another group of people do not hold power, every struggle for equality is discussed as a power struggle. And the tension between men and women, when you are discussing it as a power struggle, men that we love, men that we live with, men who gave birth to us, men that have supported us, this power struggle is a tremendous tension. And we're not sure what language to use to resolve it. But we have to use the language of human rights, and we have to use the language that includes men and brings them on board to say, this is not about women, and yet it is about women. Why have I gone through 60 years and thought, well, it's not so bad? Sometimes I think it's very bad, and then other days I go, well, it's not so bad, and it's definitely getting better. I think it is getting better. But I draw attention again to the women who have come through violent relationships and how much they have been encouraged and persuaded to feel that their world is normal. I mean, before we get into those extreme worlds, let's just read these things out, which I would say are culturally promoted beliefs that I have bought into as a girl and which I have struggled to contend with internally. A woman should make her man's needs and wishes more important than her own. Now, I appreciate having said that not all of you are living with a man or want to live with a man. But this could include your father, it could include your son, it could include your brother. Give and take. A woman should do more of the giving. If you love someone, it's in spite of their problems. And no man is perfect. And a woman is nothing really without a man. And let's focus on the good stuff. And you have to understand that men can't control their bad behaviour. And maybe you're asking too much. And it's a woman's nature to enjoy domination. and it's a woman's role to make sure that a man feels successful and to promote him and prevent the world from diminishing him and preserving his dignity at all times. Now, I'm not saying that everybody goes on and does that every day, but I'm only talking personally. It's very hard to unlock those ideas from yourself, because often just acting equally seems to feel like you are misbehaving, taking up too much space and requiring too much. I say that not having been party to a relationship that is intending to make me feel that way. I bring my own preconceptions. And then when you talk to the women who have been locked into a relationship that has closed them down and allowed them to take violence as normal, they develop the learned behaviour and they become dependent. They're dependent on their fathers and their husbands. They have this huge fear of losing things, losing belongings, losing social status, losing economically, losing their children. And they don't want to disrupt their children, and they don't want to disrupt their families. They also develop low self-esteem. And they want love, and they want to be loved, and they want to earn that love, and they keep putting out the idea that if I am good enough, nice enough, kind enough, reasonable enough, I will be loved. It will become clear that I am lovable, and I will then return to equal status. And yet, as I hear from all the women I discuss these things with, that's not what happens. The greater one is a supplicant, the more irritating one is, and the more lowly one becomes. So this psychology of inequality, which I must be party of since I've never known an equal world, I'm interested to know how we can get beyond that psychology. Obviously, events like this weekend, where we talk a great deal about the things that baffle us, the things that concern us, the things that we have tried to change but we haven't found the right vehicle. It builds our stamina, it builds our sense of belonging to each other, it builds our empathy for other people's stories. But it's still very difficult to know how we are going to make real, radical, lasting, practical change. Why do we stay, is what I call this. Because what I realize is that when you stay in a situation, people assume that you don't mind it that much. If you put up with stuff, people think, well, you must think it's okay, really, otherwise you'd leave, wouldn't you? Now, I am not going to try to explain in detail the complexities of why women who are in obviously terrifying or difficult situations don't leave, can't leave. But by and large, they don't and can't leave until something absolutely critical triggers that leaving process and they know they're going to a place of safety. So if you don't mind me continuing with this analogy for a minute, why don't we leave an unequal world where we are financially insecure, where we are subject to violence, where we are subject to misogyny, where we are subject to all the things that we've talked about this weekend? Why don't we leave when we know, because of all the great things that we've heard about this weekend, the incredible physical prowess that women have, the amazing mental capacity, the enormous capacity for emotional intelligence, all the things that women are and can be. Why aren't we leaving? Well, it's laughably obvious, isn't it? There is not another world. Even Bettany Hughes, the great classicist, can't point to a world that once upon a time existed where men and women were equal. So it's not like we can say, well, I think I'm going off to Timbuktu land or such and such land. I'm not going to the magic faraway tree that Enid Blyton existed, and there's a land there called Equal Land, because it doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, and because we can't leave, people think that we don't really mind that much. And so when we read the papers this morning, and you look through at the level of ridicule and humiliation that women are subject to in public life, you look through at the objectification of the body, you look through at everything from the casual slur to the absolute insult, and we don't, on a daily basis, pile those papers into the centre of Trafalgar Square and burn them and ritually dance around them, although that sounds fun as I'm describing it, because we don't do that, because we don't boycott, because we don't stop buying things, because we go to things, because we put up with things, actually people say, well, if she wanted to leave, she would. So what do we do with this paradox? There isn't another world to go to, and by staying in the world that we're in, it looks like it's not so bad. But we wouldn't all be here, men and women together, if we didn't know that it is very bad. It is extremely and horrifyingly bad for some girls and women. And on a daily basis, it is bad here too. But we get used to it. We put all the things that are not so bad together, and it makes for a good life for some of us. And then those people who are really suffering from this terrible imbalance of power, we label them as victims of domestic abuse, or refugees, or victims of rape. We label other women and put them into a box and then carry on. Now, I'm not accusing you of doing that. You're here this weekend in order to unpack those boxes. But I am really saying that unless we take every single thing that is a symbol of power inequality, we are not helping our boys and girls in the next generation to really think that there is a different world that is going to be created. And every year I have to ask myself, do I really believe that I'm going to create a different world with everybody here? Or am I sort of playing around the edges and feeling indignant and going away thinking, well, I felt indignant all weekend, and that's definitely changed things? Because feeling indignant in itself doesn't change things. Practical action does. Somebody said to me earlier today, it is amazing what's happened with some aspects of cultural change. Yes, legislation was brought in to stop people smoking in public places and in hospitals. But at the same time as that, there was a growing sense that actually smoking was something which was not just bad for the individual's health, but it was also bad for all our healths. It wasn't something that was just a private matter. It wasn't a sort of domestic smoking dispute. It was something that belonged to everybody in the sense of health and well-being. And although economically it looked like it was good, economically actually it was terrible. And we've accepted very quickly an idea that we are going to change our practice towards smoking. There are other examples, and they sound glib. Seatbelts would be another one. But actually, there are really examples of when societies go, we're not going to accept this any longer. We've come huge strides forward with regards to racial inequality. And even though Barack Obama at Salem this morning said, yes, far but not far enough, that road has been paved. And I think the way that we have gathered together to talk about all rights to do with sexual preferences suggests that we have paved a road. But I'm not clear whether the world has gathered together yet to say the world of inequality between men and women needs paving and we're all at this together. I'm not sure. I don't feel that. And yet, I go back to those statistics, and we're half of the world. And I wonder whether that's what it's about. I wonder whether it's because it is such an enormous job and such a huge change of culture that would be required that everyone's very scared because they don't quite know what that would feel like. Even women don't know what it would feel like, nor men. And maybe we're all scared of doing something too big and too soon in case it's too different. It's certainly not a world that we know. None of us can describe it. Creativity is about stepping into the unknown. You have to go to a place. You can't in advance describe it. You can have a hunch about it, and then you've got to work out how to get there. And I think we need all our creativity now to think, what would this gender equal world look like? What would be the consequences of a gender equal world? What would it look like domestically? What would it look like in terms of health? What would it look like sexually? We have to use our creativity and our imagination and try to conjure it up. Because actually we don't describe that world very much. We spend a lot of time telling each other what the current problems are. But we very rarely describe what if it looked like this. And maybe that's because it feels so fanciful and a bit vague. But we have to imagine a world where we can open a paper and not feel demeaned or humiliated. We have to imagine a playground where boys and girls enjoy each other's company and don't try to threaten each other and don't try to put one over on each other on the ground of sex and gender. We have to imagine a world without thinking that we're being ridiculously romantic. Just as a woman who is in an unsafe place has to imagine that there is a place of safety and self-esteem waiting for her somewhere out there. And believe me, as those women have talked to me, that seems as unlikely to them as a gender equal world might seem to us. But I'm asking myself, and therefore I suppose I'm asking you as friends and colleagues and supporters, to put more time into imagining a gender equal world so that we can get more practical about saying, well, this is how we'll do it. Many of you in this room run campaigns, 50-50 in Parliament, campaigns about sexual education, campaigns about health. We have to make those campaigns stick. We can't now say that we'll leave it to some women to be very irritating and always exhausted. We've got to all become irritating and all become exhausted. And I really mean that. Michael Bloomberg, I think it was in New York, had a zero tolerance in New York. New York was a terrifying, frightening, hostile, violent place for a very long time. And Michael Bloomberg brought in a zero tolerance culture, which said every time a window is broken, we will fix that window immediately. Every time a garbage can is overflowing, we will fix that immediately. And very, very quickly, quicker than one would have thought, by absolutely stamping on the small things, it became custom and practice to expect that New York would be a place of safety. Now, I'm not standing here to advertise New York as a place, but what I'm simply saying is that things like Laura Bates' everyday sexism is unbelievably important, because everything that you can experience on a small level has a domino effect right up to the way that the Nigerian girls are being treated this very minute. They're all connected, and it's our tribe called women. So I feel that we must go back and look at our own lives and say, how are we complicit? And this is not to blame us, but simply to say, have we got the courage to wake up even further? Do we have that courage to say, I notice I do 70% of the household chores, and I notice that my daughter will be noticing this, or my son will be noticing this. I notice that I always feel guilty, twice as guilty, if I don't do such and such a thing. And I notice that my niece or my nephew notices me doing that. All of these things where we decide that we are not quite good enough to be equal, but if we just work harder and try harder and solve everything, we might get there. This is all learnt culture. And I want to say something as well about neuroscience and genetics and DNA, of which I am wholly unqualified to discuss. Completely unqualified. But it's made me hopeful in a strange sort of way. I happen to have a son and a daughter, and therefore I've had many conversations with parents who go, well, I gave my son, dolls and teddies and blankets, and he picked up a gun as soon as he possibly could. Or, my daughter this, that, and then she wanted the pink frilly Cinderella slippers. they've been doing an experiment recently on mice. It's always on mice, isn't it? Poor mice. But it's an important experiment where they gave a group of mice a smell, a particular smell, coffee smell, and then electric shock on their feet. And so the mice got very frightened whenever they smelt the coffee. They expected the electric shock. When the mice had children, the next generation of mice smelt the coffee and still had a traumatic reaction, even though they never had an electric shock. And when the grandchildren mice smelt the coffee, the same thing happened. And they've begun to discuss the possibility that behaviour, experience, trauma, ideas, in other words, culture, is passed on down through generation after generation. And that, in a way, relieves my anxiety to a degree, because I don't think it is possible for us all to simply go, in one generation, we are going to solve the difference between what men seem to want to be and what women seem to want to be. I think it might take a lot longer than that. But in order to unlearn behaviour, we have to have something consistent patterns of change. And that's what we've all got to set out to do. So my closing point, why doesn't she leave, is we need to be very grateful for the expertise, and it is there, of the women who have really not been able to leave their refugee camp or their house or their relationship, because they have all the information as to why the world hemmed them in through the power structures and almost re-navigated them to accept something that was terrifying as normal. Because I think that what we will realize is that we are accepting something as normal that is vast inequality. And we've got to drop the scales from our eyes, we've got to stop being complicit, and we have to all take action. So when I go back and think about this 2/3 of the women can't read, how are we going to change the pattern of behaviour in our country and in other countries? We've got to do it together. Can we get 17% of all parliamentarians in the world to become 50%? How are we going to do that? Can we get 2/3 of the women who can't read to become all the women in the world can read? How are we going to do that? How are we going to take away the fact that 2 women every day are murdered in this country by their partners? How are we going to solve that? So let's not just talk anymore about the fact that it happens, so that we've got a lot of information. We must bring all the activist groups together. We must join forces. We must address it in Parliament. But we must go away to our partners, our friends, our sons, our fathers, and say, this is a world that where the power difference has been so distorted for so long, we've just got so used to it. Can we change it? Will you help change it? Will everybody help change it? And to do that, we have to fully own it, just how unequal it is. Even though we're sitting here on a nice day, having had a nice time, it doesn't change the facts that I've read out. And that's where I wanted to leave it. I started 5 years ago thinking if I start a Women of the World Festival up, people are going to be really cross with me because they're going to say, for goodness sake, we did all that once upon a time. But we didn't. We've by no means done all that. And so what's so encouraging 5 years on, and looking forward to the next year, is that there are now thousands, millions of men and women who've sensed this inequality afresh. But the difference is, I think this time, is we're going to put in place legislation and a cultural change so that we cannot pretend any longer that it's sort of okay. It is not sort of okay to be racist. It is not okay to be a bit homophobic. It is not okay to have a bit of discrimination against disability. And it is certainly not okay to be a bit sexist. It is not okay. And so everybody needs to go away and go, it is not okay to live in a world that is a bit unequal.